Welcome to the Poundcast, the Digital Pound Foundation's podcast, dedicated to explaining and discussing all aspects of a digital pound and the impact of new forms of digital money. Your host today is Jannah Patchay, Policy Lead and Executive Director of the Digital Pound Foundation. Today, Jannah speaks to Lord Holmes of Richmond about the UK's role as a leader in the innovation, Fintech and emerging digital economy space, recent developments in UK legislation affecting the industry, what he sees as some of the most important use cases for digital currencies, and how we can address public concerns and ensure the widest possible public discourse and engagement in the process of rolling out a central bank digital currency.
I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today on the Poundcast by our first member of the House of Lords, Lord Holmes of Richmond. Welcome, Chris. It's great to have you here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And to get us started off, could you please tell us a little bit about your background, what brought you to the work you do today, and your main areas of interest?
Well, thank you. And again, it's a real pleasure to be with you all today. I'm Chris. I joined the House of Lords a decade ago in 2013, and my main areas of interest centre around inclusion and innovation, talent and technology, really seeing how we can use these new technologies for the public good, for the common good, for private good, for national and global good. So very much across fintech, AI, DLT, and indeed other emerging technologies, and also have a sprinkling of culture, media and sport in there, because in a previous life, I was fortunate enough to swim for Great Britain. And also I was one of the directors who led the team that delivered the London Olympic Games and Paralympic Games. So really a lot of what I'm doing is carrying on those threads around enabling, empowering talent. And as we know, some of these new technologies can be so fantastically deployed to enable all that human talent.
I've followed your work for some years in this space. We've often interacted in various working groups and think tank environments and things like that. And it's great to have someone who's so active in the legislative process, who's also so informed and knowledgeable about some of the issues that arise from frontier technologies. Why do you think it is so important for the UK to be a leader in technology and innovation, in fintech, and in the emerging digital economy space?
I think we have a real opportunity in the UK when one puts together a number of the factors that we've built and developed over centuries. If we consider the financial centre of the City of London and how financial services indeed ripple right around all of the devolved nations of the United Kingdom, when we put that together with our geography, our time zone, and crucially, when we put that together with common law, it gives us a real unique opportunity to scope out the development of all of these new technologies, because we understand how to do innovation in a way which is for the public good, individual, community, city, country, global good. And it's when all those factors come together when we're at our best as a nation. And the reality is, when one looks at the global headwinds which we're currently facing, as indeed all nations are, the climate emergency, the energy crisis, the current cost of living difficulties, stubborn inflationary pressures, we need to deploy, to develop all of the opportunities that come through that combination of human-led, in our human hands, these new technologies. Because together, human-led, I really believe that we can drive forward some fabulous social, economic, and indeed psychologically beneficial new chapters for us as individuals, and indeed for us as a nation. Forward-thinking, outward-looking, connecting, collaborating, very much an international focus, but very much the UK with an opportunity to lead amongst friends from other nations around the world.
Now, I'm going to go a little off-piste here, as I don't think this was a question that we discussed, but it seems to follow on quite nicely from what you've just been saying. In order to achieve all these things, cooperation, collaboration, leadership in technology innovation, the practical application of technology to solve really human challenges that are facing us and the planet. What do we need to do as a country? What kind of frameworks do we need to have in place? What kind of policy do we need to have in place?
Firstly, it needs to be human-led. And that sounds easy and obvious, but it really needs to be driven through all of this, human-led. If we don't make a success of this, it won't be a failure of technology. It will be a failure of us. We're prime. We must lead on this stuff. So firstly, the human leadership, then the international perspective, being open to convene, to collaborate, to create through that process, then to understand key concepts such as interoperability. There's no point putting a technological solution or a regulatory regime in place if that concept of interoperability hasn't been well thought through and doesn't run through that as a thread. So yeah, interesting things happening on our legislative and regulatory framework, which we'll come on to in a bit, but interoperability, absolutely critical to that. And probably under all of that, having a rationally positive, rationally optimistic perspective, not being rose-tinted spectacled about this, not pretending that we are not grappling with extraordinarily global pressures, extraordinarily national and local issues, not pretending that for a minute, but being rationally positive that if we do come together and connect around human-led technologies, we can start to make a real difference to the kind of solutions and indeed the pace of solutions that we may be able to bring to bear.
And you've mentioned a few times this concept of human-led technologies. Can you unpack that a little bit more? What do you mean by human-led technologies, and how do we develop these human-led technologies?
Certainly. Well, if we take the most talked about technology of our time, certainly AI, which is used in so many different ways with so many different understandings and different meanings. But if we just take it as a useful phrase for the time being, we're talking about artificial intelligence. Well, what do we need from this? We need, firstly, to be assured that it can do more than what we could just do of ourselves, and that it can do it in a more efficient and potentially a more effective way. So what's required? We need to lead. We need to ensure that we don't just simply bake human bias into the black box. So that's not just bias of the potential data which is being ingested. That's bias within the technology and how it operates in a really technical way. It's bias in terms of how that's constructed and being cognizant of that all the way through that process. So in a sense, not looking to simply believe that a lot of data can be chucked in and clever algorithms put together and that will give us better answers. It's understanding the human element. And when I say that, I mean how that human element can be extraordinarily negative if we don't consider those elements of it all the way through the process. So being cognizant, being reflective, being real time about every element of the development, the construction, the testing, and indeed the deployment of any technology. And I say AI is the best example to bring to bear because to misquote a movie from a long time ago, it really does seem at the moment that AI is all around us.
Yeah, I would love to talk more about the AI points. It's such a fascinating area. And perhaps if we get a little bit more time towards the end, we could dive into your thoughts on that a little bit more. But first, can you tell us a little bit about some of the legislation, the key bits of legislation that you've been working on lately that are enablers of this human-led technology future?
What's positive is that myself and colleagues have been able to bring more of these discussions, debates, and indeed changes to legislation concerning all of these issues around new technologies. That's a sort of overarching positive. The two pieces of legislation I draw on for the first half of this year would be the Financial Services and Markets Act, which received royal assent at the end of last month, and the Electronic Trade Documents Bill, which touch wood will receive royal assent very shortly. The first, the Financial Services and Markets Act, is the most significant financial services piece of regulation in a generation since FSMA 2000. It puts the framework for a forward-looking approach to our financial regulatory framework. It enables a structure for digital assets. It talks about cash and the importance of that, even as the future is obviously, inevitably, and needs to be positively digital. But we need to make sure that the transition to that future, and indeed that future itself, is inclusive, and cash is a key part of that. So that the Act is very clear on free cash access services. And then looking at the critical role of the regulator, putting a lot of amendments down, which fortunately the government accepted, around having the right level of parliamentary scrutiny of our regulators. Because obviously with the changes with our relationship with the EU, now our financial services regulators have increasing powers when it comes to the regulatory framework, which will sit over our financial services industry and financial services ecosystem. So it's right that Parliament has the right level of scrutiny across all that area. So we're able to get significant improvements to the bill during its stages in the Lords. Turning to the Electronic Trade Documents Bill, it's a bill that I've described as the most important bill no one has ever heard of. And why is it important? It's a very small bill. It does something very simple. It means, or it enables, trade documents, such as bills of lading, to be held digitally. Now, many people may think, well, gosh, this is surely old hat. Surely you've been able to have digital documents for decades. Well, the difference is, in contrast to a smart contract, trade documents are possessive in nature. And what that simply means is you hold the paper, you hold the goods. So what was required to enable these trade documents to be held digitally was that the technology could exist for somebody to prove that they hold that digital document. No one else holds that digital document. You can see who else has held that digital document in the past and proves that at that moment in time, you are the only holder of that document. Thus, you can possess the goods to which it relates. Great piece of legislation because it's incredibly simple, incredibly straightforward, and incredibly short. It's an object lesson in how to legislate to a specific purpose. Economic benefits, trade can now be done in seconds rather than between a week and 2 weeks. There's obviously an economic benefit there. But imagine the environmental benefits as well, where previously, say if a ship had been coming into the port of Singapore, but its trade document was in London, somebody would have to board a plane at Heathrow, go to Singapore to connect that document with the goods to enable that trade to take place. Well, imagine taking all of that out of the loop. You've got the economic benefit and you've got the environmental benefit. It's a lovely piece of legislation, and there'll be a suite of further pieces of legislation around this digital assets and decentralized autonomous organizations, etc., coming forward. I think it's probably the first time that Parliament has really gripped this sense of how to legislate to enable the digital opportunity. I say it's short, it's simple, it's straightforward. It's a great way to legislate.
It sounds like a huge leap forward, and I'm particularly picking up on your mention of the technology now existing that basically enables not only the ability to prove unique ownership of something in digital native form, but also full transferability of ownership. So it's not copyable, but ownership is, there's no question as to whether something is fully transferred or whether a copy has been retained. And it's a technology as well that you've been a particular advocate of in various applications. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Certainly. And I saw a real opportunity about a decade ago with blockchain, or distributed ledger technology, if you will. And I did a report in 2017, distributed ledger technology for public good, leadership, collaboration, innovation. And there were two reasons, at least, why I did that report. Firstly, to set out the opportunities for public good from this technology. But secondly, to try and ensure that those public goods could have a chance of being realized, or at least experimented with, proof of concepted with, because the danger on the flip side of the coin was that potentially it seemed to me that all of the opportunities from blockchain could be stopped before they'd even had a chance to begin, because of how in public discourse blockchain and Bitcoin were seen as the same thing. And obviously there are a lot of rightly framed discussions around Bitcoin, pro and negative, talking about how it operates, talking about the technology behind it, et cetera, talking about its speculative in nature. So I thought it was critical to draw the distinction between what the technology is and what a specific application, i.e. Bitcoin, was of it, and how other potential applications could do some pretty interesting things, such as, for example, atomic settlement at the border. Imagine that, rather than a truck having to stop on a line at the border, pull out a whole bunch of papers, which would then be checked, registration, cargo documents, et cetera. Imagine what one could do with distributed ledger technology. There could not only be a way in real time to connect the lorry, the driver, the goods, the customs requirements, the finance, all of that into that atomic moment in time. That's pretty much a transformation of how not only a border operates, but how we think of a border. Truly transformational. Similarly, in the NHS, currently, we spend 25,000 doctor days involved in proving credentials for doctors. Incredibly important. We want to know that the person operating on us, the person that we're consulting with, is the person that she or he says they are, and that they have the relevant qualifications and experience that they say they have. Incredibly important for that to all be proved. 25,000 doctor days, but with a relatively straightforward DLT solution, those 25,000 days could be reduced into minutes, and those 25,000 days could be converted into 25,000 days of patient care. That's some public good.
And that's a very real life, concrete application that resonates with people in terms of, the efficiencies, the savings, resource that could be redeployed elsewhere and things like that. Carrying on the subject of blockchain and distributed ledger technology, and how it's, again, that ability to support uniqueness of an asset and full transferability of ownership that has led in turn to the ability to create and issue digital native assets and digital native forms of currency on these technologies. How do you see the emergence of digital assets and digital currencies supporting the UK's continued leadership in financial services and the fintech sector?
It's very interesting what's happening with particularly central bank digital currencies at the moment, with pretty much every central bank looking into this area and doing proofs of concept. It's great that the BIS innovation team are very much involved with it, not least in London. And it's right that this should be really carefully thought through, because, again, as has always been the case with all of these technology, this isn't just a question of will the technology work, important though that is. It's not just a question of can it be structured in a financially sound, a monetarily sound way, important though that is. It brings in really what it is to be part of a human society. So obvious, critically important concepts such as privacy really come to the fore, because if it wasn't constructed in a human way, a CBDC could be extraordinarily unfortunate for a society, for a polity. But if it's constructed in the right way, with all of those human values, with everything that we understand about an ethical way of going about life, then the opportunities could be vast in terms of what you could do with the programmability of the digital currency, which goes way beyond the monetary features of it, and could really get after some of those problems that have seemed intractable or beyond our reach to solve. So in short, huge potential, more than worthy of experimentation, proof of concepting, deep thinking about, but very much, again, thinking about it from that human, ethical, values-based perspective.
Specifically in the UK, the Bank of England has been very actively exploring the potential for a UK retail CBDC. And there was a 2020 discussion paper on central bank digital currency. There's a recent consultation on the digital pound, which is joint H&T and Bank of England consultation paper, which is recently closed. What do you think the benefits specifically for the UK are in terms of introducing a CBDC? Because I ask this as different jurisdictions seem to have different policy drivers for introducing CBDCs. In some, it's about, quite fundamental logistics, like the Bahamas and hundreds of islands, and hundreds of, ATMs across disparate islands to fill up and things like that. And for others, it's about widening financial inclusion because there's good mobile coverage, there's good, access to devices, but it's the financial inclusion angle that needs addressing. For, the US, the tentative explorations in progress are about looking at how the US dollar can retain its kind of dominance on the world stage. For the EU, it's about, greater market integration. But what's the killer case for the UK to introduce a CBDC in your view?
For me, it's two things. It's the ability through financial inclusion to really enable and empower millions of people who have found themselves on the sharp end of financial exclusion for far too long, and reaching a bit beyond that as well. That applies to micro and small businesses as well, who may well have found themselves partially financially excluded. So it's the financial inclusion bit, and it's the disintermediation piece, that the efficiencies that can be driven, the costs that can be taken out, and the ability in a positive way get closer to people right across the nation for their benefit if constructed correctly. And that's the crucial point. None of this is inevitably good or inevitably bad. It takes us back to that key point that the CBDC has to be human-led, human-constructed, with human ethics, human values right at the heart of it.
And I think those are really important points and considerations. How do we ensure in practice that a UK CBDC has those goals embedded in it? And how will your role as a parliamentarian and policymaker really help ensure that the CBDC can deliver those goals?
By doing the right testing, the right experimentation in safe environments. I think we've demonstrated in the UK a real expertise in terms of establishing sandboxes. You'll be aware of the Fintech regulatory sandbox that was set up almost a decade ago, and the real benefits that came from that. Take any measure of success. Well, why not take this when it's been replicated in well over 50 jurisdictions around the world? We've now got the FMI, the Financial Market Infrastructure Sandbox, another thing which has come out of the work that we've all done together on the Financial Services and Markets Act. That's come out of that as a consultation, which just came out this week again on the FMI sandboxing and the potential use cases there. So a real opportunity to look at how, through a sandboxing approach, you can have that safe environment for experimentation and development, testing, experimenting, doing the right thinking, and crucially, again, having the right parliamentary input. So a CBDC can't come to be without primary legislation through both houses of parliament, and through that, establishing the right oversight boards, similar to how the PRA, for example, works with Prudential Regulation Authority, works at the bank as it stands, having a sense that there would be the right level of oversight board within the bank, but also the right accountability and scrutiny from Parliament as to the establishment of, and then the ongoing running of, a central bank digital currency, because it's such a fundamental thing for any nation. Thus, it's a fundamental transformation for the United Kingdom. It's right that people's representatives in Parliament have more than a say on that.
And on a final note, because I know we're running out of time, and you did touch on this earlier, that the potential for a CBDC to be perceived, even if it's not, as having all sorts of concerns associated with it. So there's a increasingly concern from the public, from consumer groups, from questions being asked by the media and things like that around privacy in a CBDC design and how there can be confidence in government respect for privacy in the future, around programmability and what programmability might mean in practice. Will money be will the government be able to evaporate away their money, for example? And these are very valid concerns. We've seen in China's CBDC design, for example, many of these aspects are being explored in their various pilots. What would you say to people to our listeners who have these concerns?
The most important thing with a CBDC, as with all of these new technologies, is that we have the level of public debate, public discourse, and public engagement around it, because through that, it takes us back to that human-led point. Through that, we will get to the optimal answer. And if we look at an example from history with IVF, what could be more scary, what could be more science fiction than making human form in a test tube? And yet, why is that not just seen as part of our society, but such a positive part of our society? Because right from the outset, a colleague here, Baroness Warnock, had the Warnock Commission, which really launched that public discussion, public debate, public involvement in what IVF was seeking to achieve and what this would mean for people and how it would operate. If you can have that fully fledged public engagement, real public engagement, not just the often rolled out myth of consultation, but that real public engagement, these things are far more likely to come up with the optimal solutions. And if you don't, irrespective from whether the thing may have some intrinsic good or not, if we don't do that, most likely, whatever that technology, whatever that potential currency, whatever that potential opportunity is, highly likely it never gets the chance to get off the start blocks.
I know I said that would be the last question, but I think, from both the Digital Pound Foundation's perspective and some of the people that we've been engaging with who are raising these sorts of questions, how do we actually achieve that level of public engagement? Because it's a really difficult one to get, to have that level of engagement across such a wide, spectrum of different demographics, of different types of user. And yet, as you say, it's completely necessary if we want to ensure trust and understanding in any future CBDC.
In the first instance, we all have to use the positions that we hold, the voices that we have to get the messages out there, to get the concepts, the descriptions, the opportunities, the challenges out there through all of our channels, all of our connections, all of our relationships. There's a responsibility on all of us to do that, to really try and, in all those environments, get this so much more discussed. And it's entirely possible. If you see what ChatGPT has done as a byproduct in terms of people talking about AI now, where even 6 months ago, perhaps it was significantly less, that shows how quickly it's possible to get a level of engagement. I believe with this, it's beholden on all of us to use our position, to use our voices, to enable every voice to appreciate that not only does every individual have a voice, but that voice needs to be in the mix. That voice needs to be heard.
Chris, it's been absolutely fantastic having you on the Poundcast today. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's an absolute pleasure. And thank you very much. If anybody wants to be in touch, I'd really love to hear all your ideas, your thoughts, your hopes, your fears for the potential of all of these technologies, not least the CBDC. Do be in touch with me on LinkedIn. Would absolutely love to hear from you. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah.